Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking what's got to be one of the most fascinating textual mysteries in all of biblical history. We are diving into a literal ancient detective story, looking at a massive literary cover-up right in the Gospel of Mark. It's a really wild story full of narrative shock, scribal panic, and we'll see exactly how a growing institution completely reshaped a radical text just to fit its own needs.
So let's just start by asking, have you ever been driven completely crazy by a story that abruptly stops and gives you absolutely no closure? You know the feeling, right? You're watching a movie, the tension is building, and suddenly the screen just cuts to black right at the climax. It leaves you hanging. You walk out of the theater feeling unresolved, maybe even a little cheated. You want answers. You want that neat and tidy wrap-up where everything finally makes sense.
Well, believe it or not, that exact feeling of narrative shock is what early Christians experienced, because the original Gospel of Mark actually ends right here. It says, "They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And it just drops off. Terrified women fleeing the tomb in absolute silence. From a purely literary standpoint, it is a total masterclass in suspense, but for the early church, it was completely unacceptable. The story just stops with fear and flight. There's no triumphant meeting with a resurrected Christ. There is no happy ending.
Now this brings us to a concept known as horror vacui, which basically translates to the fear of empty space, or the void. What's absolutely mind-blowing about this is that the original Greek sentence in Mark 16:8 literally trails off on the conjunction gar, which means because or for. The text essentially says, because they were afraid of, and then just completely stops. It's like ending a sentence with because and just walking out of the room. This cliffhanger created an unbearable theological vacuum that terrified later scribes. They literally could not handle the empty space, and they definitely couldn't handle the lack of closure. So they decided to fix it.
Let's move into part one, the forensics, and look at the actual evidence in the manuscripts.
When you look at the physical texts we have today, things get really weird and disjointed. For example, ancient scribes of the Codex Vaticanus handled this by leaving a deliberate, gaping blank column right after verse 8. They clearly knew something was supposed to go there, or maybe they knew other endings were floating around, but they refused to write them in because they knew they weren't the original text. And then, when you look at the clunky syntactic jump into the forged verse 9, it's super jarring. It abruptly introduces Mary Magdalene as a woman from whom he had cast out 7 demons. It introduces her as a complete stranger, even though she was literally just the main character in the preceding paragraphs. It's incredibly disjointed, kind of like really bad editing.
And the external evidence against this? It's overwhelmingly clear. The famous long ending of Mark, which are the verses most people actually have in their printed Bibles today, is completely missing from the oldest, most reliable manuscripts we have. It's missing in the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus, it's not in the Codex Vaticanus, it's totally absent from ancient Syriac and Coptic translations. The heavyweights of the early church, like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, didn't even recognize it, and historians like Eusebius and Jerome explicitly noted that almost all the Greek manuscripts they had access to stopped dead right at verse 16:8.
But for me, the absolute linguistic smoking gun is this number right here, 18. In the 12 verses of the forged long ending, there are 18 entirely unique Greek words that appear literally nowhere else in Mark's entire gospel. Suddenly, the vocabulary shifts, the style shifts. It's a dead giveaway that a completely different author took over and just tacked their own voice onto the end of Mark's original work.
All right, on to part 2, ancient rescue operations, or how they frantically tried to fix this vacuum.
It's wild, but history actually preserves 4 entirely distinct states of this text. It proves that early Christians intensely manipulated the ending over several centuries just to force some kind of resolution. You start with the original abrupt stop. Then, someone added what we call a shorter ending, which is just a really artificial brief sentence saying the women told Peter what happened and Jesus sent them out. Then came the famous long ending, adding all these post-resurrection stories and those controversial promises about handling snakes and drinking poison. And finally, by the 5th century, a scribe even shoved another apocryphal text, known as the Freer Logion, right into the middle of the long ending to talk about the end of Satan's age. I mean, it was basically a textual free-for-all.
Moving on to part 3, anatomy of the long ending. Let's dissect this pastiche.
So if Mark didn't write it, where did it come from? Well, scholars realize the long ending is essentially a pastiche. An anonymous early 2nd century author basically created a greatest hits album. They heavily plagiarized from the other already accepted Gospels to give Mark's text an upgrade.
Verses 9 and 10 about Mary Magdalene, lifted straight from John 20. The appearance to the two disciples, that's a highly compressed summary of the Road to Emmaus story from Luke 24. The Great Commission to preach to the world is borrowed right from the end of Matthew 28. Even the wild stuff about snakes and poison is drawn from the book of Acts and early church folk traditions. It is literally a Frankenstein's monster of a text stitched together to make Mark conform with everyone else.
Which brings us to part 4, taming the radical text, and the true motive behind all of this. You really have to put yourself in their shoes here. The rapidly forming institutional church simply couldn't handle this level of literary ambiguity. They were trying to build a global religion, and they desperately needed a harmonized ending that projected authority and strict orthodoxy. They needed all the Gospels to agree with each other. They needed concrete, undeniable proof of a physical resurrection to combat all those early theological debates. And of course, they needed a clear mandate for their apostolic mission to go out and conquer the world. Mark's original ending, with silent, terrified women running away, provided absolutely none of that.
So ultimately, what we're looking at with the canonization of the long ending is the classic domestication of a deeply disturbing, highly provocative literary work. Mark's original vision was this radical challenge to its audience. But as we know, institutions don't really like radical challenges. They like safety, they like structure, and they like clear answers. So they just took the pen into their own hands and domesticated the text, ensuring it neatly matched the standard of their developing orthodoxy. But here's the tragedy in all this. By erasing that original cliffhanger, those ancient redactors shielded future readers from the brilliant, challenging question the original author actually intended to leave us with. You see, the original Gospel of Mark was an interactive text. It threw the responsibility right into the lap of the reader. It fundamentally asked, the women at the tomb failed out of fear. So, will you fail too? It's an absolutely incredible question, and one that was very nearly lost to history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this changes the way you look at how these ancient texts have been passed down to us.